The morning sun peeked through the blinds of Richard's home office as he rubbed his tired eyes. Another night of barely 4 hours of sleep. The stack of contracts on his desk seemed to multiply every time he looked away. Being the CEO of Parker Industries wasn't just demanding, it was all-consuming. At 38, Richard had climbed the corporate ladder with single-minded determination. After his wife Priya passed away 3 years ago from an unexpected illness, he threw himself even deeper into his work. It was his escape, his purpose, his distraction from the gaping hole her absence had left in their lives. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Dad?" A small voice called out. "Are you busy?" Richard quickly minimized the spreadsheet on his computer and swiveled his chair toward the door. "Never too busy for you, sweetheart." Anya, his 7-year-old daughter, stood in the doorway clutching her favorite stuffed elephant. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and she was still in her unicorn pajamas despite it being almost noon. "Can you help me with my science project? It's due tomorrow." Richard's heart sank. Tomorrow? How had he missed that? He vaguely remembered signing a permission slip for something, but the details were lost in the chaos of the last 2 weeks of merger negotiations. "Of course," he said, forcing a smile while mentally rearranging his day. The video conference with Tokyo would have to wait. Again. "What's the project about?" "We have to make a model of the solar system," Anya said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "Ms. Lee said we need to use recycled materials." Richard glanced at his watch. He had exactly 4 hours before his next unmovable commitment, a meeting with potential investors that could determine the future of his company's expansion into European markets. "Let's see what we can find around the house," he said, taking her small hand in his. 3.5 hours later, their solar system looked more like a collection of random objects stuck together with excessive amounts of glue rather than an educational model. Anya didn't seem to mind, but Richard knew it wasn't his best work. He'd been distracted, checking his phone constantly, his mind wandering to the presentation he hadn't finished revising. "I think it looks great, Dad," Anya said, admiring their creation. Richard's phone buzzed with a reminder. "I'm sorry, honey. I have to get ready for my meeting. Can you clean up here while I get changed?" The disappointment in her eyes was subtle but unmistakable. She nodded silently. As he hurried to his bedroom to change, Richard caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror. The dark circles under his eyes had become permanent features. His once meticulously trimmed beard was now uneven. When had he started looking so worn down? The house was a reflection of his state of mind, dishes piled in the sink, toys scattered across the living room floor, laundry that needed to be folded sitting in baskets. Their housekeeper came twice a week, but it wasn't enough. Richard knew he was barely keeping things together. That evening, after tucking Anya into bed with a rushed goodnight story, he sat at his kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of coffee and made the call he'd been avoiding. "Sullivan Nanny Agency, how may I help you?" a cheerful voice answered. "Yes, hello. My name is Richard Parker. I'm looking to hire a full-time nanny for my daughter." After a lengthy conversation about his requirements, schedule, and expectations, the agency promised to send over profiles of qualified candidates within 48 hours. 2 weeks and 4 interviews later, Richard was beginning to lose hope. The first candidate seemed more interested in the amenities of his home than in Anya. The second couldn't work the hours he needed. The third had impressive credentials but absolutely no warmth. Richard couldn't imagine Anya connecting with her. And the fourth simply didn't show up. "We have one more candidate we'd like you to consider," said Valerie from the agency when he called to express his frustration. "She's actually new to our agency but comes with excellent references. Her name is Lena Choi. She's 32, has a degree in early childhood education, and was previously working with a family in Boston until they relocated overseas." Richard sighed. "Fine. Send over her information and we can set up an interview. The profile that arrived in his email that evening was impressive. Lena had a master's degree in education, specialized training in childhood development, and even certification in pediatric first aid. But it was the personal statement at the end of her resume that caught his attention. I believe that every child deserves to be seen, heard, and valued as a complete person with their own thoughts, feelings, and dreams. My goal is not just to care for children but to help them grow into confident, compassionate individuals who know their worth. Something about those words resonated with Richard. It was exactly what he wanted for Anya, to be seen and heard in ways he feared he was failing to provide. The interview was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Richard arranged to leave work early, a rare occurrence that raised eyebrows among his executive team. Taking a long weekend, boss, his COO had asked with surprise. Just some personal matters to attend to, Richard had replied, uncomfortable with the attention his schedule change had created. Friday arrived, and Richard found himself unusually nervous as he waited in his living room. He'd asked Mrs. Gonzalez, their housekeeper, to do an extra thorough cleaning that morning. Anya was at a playdate with a neighbor, which Richard had arranged deliberately. He wanted to form his own impression of this Lena person before introducing her to his daughter. The doorbell rang precisely at 3 p.m. Punctuality was a good start. When Richard opened the door, he was greeted by a woman of average height with a calm, assured presence. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. There was nothing flashy or pretentious about her appearance, just a simple blouse, dark pants, and practical shoes. Mr. Parker? I'm Lena Choi. Thank you for considering me for the position. Her voice was warm but professional, with a slight accent he couldn't quite place. Please, come in, Richard said, stepping aside. And call me Richard. As they sat in the living room, Richard began with his prepared questions about her experience, approach to discipline, and educational philosophy. Lena answered each question thoughtfully, without the rehearsed quality he detected in some of the other candidates. My approach is to create structure with flexibility, she explained. Children need boundaries to feel secure, but also room to explore and make mistakes. And how do you handle tantrums? Richard asked, thinking of Anya's recent emotional outbursts. Lena's expression softened. Tantrums are usually a child's way of expressing feelings they don't have words for yet. I try to help them identify what they're feeling and find better ways to communicate it. Sometimes they just need someone to listen without judgment. Her words hit uncomfortably close to home. Had he been truly listening to Anya these past months? Or had he been too preoccupied with work to notice what she was trying to tell him? What about screen time? He asked, quickly changing the subject. I believe in balance. Technology is part of our world, but it shouldn't replace human connection or creative play. I prefer to set specific times for screens and plenty of time for other activities, reading, outdoor play, art, cooking together. As the interview continued, Richard found himself impressed not just by her credentials, but by her genuine passion for child development. Unlike the other candidates, she asked thoughtful questions about Anya, her interests, her personality, her routine, rather than about the job benefits or house rules. May I ask about Anya's mother? Lena inquired gently. I noticed you mentioned you're a single father. Richard tensed slightly. This was always difficult territory. My wife passed away 3 years ago. Breast cancer. It was unexpected and progressed quickly. Lena's expression held genuine sympathy without pity. I'm very sorry for your loss. That must have been incredibly difficult for both you and Anya. Thank you, Richard said simply, not trusting himself to say more. After a moment, Lena continued. Children process grief differently than adults. Has Anya had any support in working through her feelings about her mother's passing? The question caught Richard off guard. They'd seen a child psychologist right after Priya died, but he hadn't considered that Anya might still be processing her grief 3 years later. "We saw someone initially," he admitted. "But she seemed to adjust, so we stopped." "Do you think that was a mistake?" Lena shook her head. "There's no right or wrong way to handle these situations. Every child is different. But grief isn't linear, especially for children. They revisit their loss as they reach new developmental stages and gain new understanding." As their conversation wound down, Richard found himself more impressed with Lena than he had expected to be. She was knowledgeable without being condescending, warm without being fake, and seemed genuinely interested in Anya's well-being. "I'd like you to meet my daughter," he decided. "She should be home from her playdate soon. Would you be able to stay a bit longer?" Lena smiled. "I'd be delighted to meet her." When Anya arrived home 20 minutes later, Richard watched carefully as she was introduced to Lena. His daughter was typically shy around strangers, often hiding behind his legs or speaking in whispers. To his surprise, when Lena crouched down to Anya's eye level and said, "I've heard you're quite the artist. Your dad told me about your solar system model," Anya's face lit up. "Do you want to see it?" "Dad helped, but I did most of it myself," she said proudly. "I'd love to," Lena replied with genuine enthusiasm. As Richard watched them disappear into Anya's room, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that they seemed to connect, guilt that a stranger could so easily engage his daughter in a way he struggled to do lately, and a flicker of hope that perhaps Lena could bring some stability back into their lives. When Anya's excited chatter and laughter drifted down the hallway, Richard realized it had been too long since he'd heard that sound in their home. By the time Lena left that evening, Richard had made his decision. She was exactly what they needed, someone who could provide Anya with the attention and nurturing she deserved while he managed the demands of his career. What he didn't realize was how watching Lena with his daughter over the coming weeks would force him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about success, parenting, and what truly mattered in life. Lena started the following Monday. Richard had prepared a detailed schedule, emergency contacts, and a 3-page document outlining house rules and Anya's routine. He'd spent most of Sunday night finalizing it, wanting to appear organized and in control. "This should cover everything," he said, handing Lena the neatly printed papers that morning. "Anya needs to be at school by 8:15, and her after-school activities are all listed with addresses. The pantry and fridge are fully stocked, but there's money for groceries in the envelope on the counter if you need anything specific." Lena accepted the papers with a smile. "Thank you for being so thorough. Don't worry about anything here, we'll be fine." Richard hesitated by the door, briefcase in hand. It felt strange leaving his daughter with someone new, despite the agency's extensive background checks and his own careful vetting. Anya stood in the hallway in her school uniform, her backpack shaped like a panda nearly as large as her small frame. "Have a good day at work, Dad," she said, giving him a quick hug around the waist. "Be good for Miss Lena," he replied, bending down to kiss the top of her head. "I'll try to be home for dinner." "You always say that," Anya whispered, too quietly for Lena to hear. But Richard heard, and the words stung because they were true. How many dinners had he missed in the past year? How many bedtimes? As he drove to the office, he found himself checking his phone repeatedly, half expecting emergency calls or texts. But there were none. Just the usual flood of emails and meeting reminders. By lunchtime, curiosity got the better of him. He texted Lena, "How's everything going?" Her response came quickly, "Great. Anya's at school. I organized her art supplies and prepared a healthy snack for when she gets home. We're planning to work on her reading assignment and then head to the park if that's okay with you." Richard stared at the message. It was exactly what he'd hoped for, competent, reassuring, normal. So why did he feel a twinge of something like jealousy? That evening, he made a genuine effort to leave the office by 6 p.m., delegating the final review of quarterly projections to his CFO. He wanted to see for himself how Anya and Lena were getting along. When he walked through the front door at 6:30, the house smelled of something delicious. Music played softly from the kitchen, and he could hear Anya's giggle, a sound that had become increasingly rare in recent months. He followed the sounds and scents to find Anya standing on a step stool at the kitchen counter, carefully measuring flour into a bowl while Lena supervised. Both wore aprons, and there was a light dusting of flour on Anya's nose. "Dad!" Anya exclaimed, her face lighting up with surprise. "You're home early. We're making pizza from scratch." "I can see that," Richard said, smiling at the scene. "Looks like fun." "Miss Lena says cooking is like science and art mixed together," Anya informed him seriously. "We're experimenting with different toppings." Lena wiped her hands on her apron. "Welcome home. We didn't expect you so early. Would you like to join us? There's plenty of dough." The invitation caught Richard off guard. He'd become so accustomed to being an observer in his own home, coming in after Anya was asleep, leaving before she was fully awake, catching glimpses of her life between meetings and conference calls. "I'd like that," he said, surprised by how much he meant it. That night, they ate homemade pizza at the kitchen table. Anya chatted excitedly about her day, her science test, she got an A, and how Lena had helped her practice her spelling words by turning it into a hopscotch game in the backyard. "Miss Lena knows so many cool games," Anya said between bites. "And she doesn't even look at her phone all the time like Mrs. Henderson did." Richard raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Henderson had been the college student who'd watched Anya occasionally before Lena. He hadn't realized how much his daughter had noticed. After dinner, when Anya went upstairs to get ready for bed, Richard helped Lena clean up the kitchen. "Thank you for dinner," he said, loading plates into the dishwasher. "It's been a while since we've had a proper meal together." "It was Anya's idea," Lena replied. "She said you like pizza but never have time to make it from scratch." Richard paused, a glass in his hand. "She said that?" Lena nodded, her expression gentle but direct. "She talks about you a lot. She's very proud of her dad, the important businessman who helps people have jobs." Richard felt his throat tighten. Is that how Anya saw his work? As helping people have jobs? It was a surprisingly optimistic interpretation of his role, which he more often viewed as the relentless pursuit of profit margins and market share. "I'm trying to be here more," he said, feeling the need to explain himself. "It's just been difficult since Priya died. The company needed steady leadership, and I needed." He trailed off, uncertain how to finish the thought. "A place to put your grief," Lena finished quietly. The simple truth of her words caught him off guard. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "It's very common," she continued, wiping down the counter. "Especially for parents. Sometimes it feels safer to focus on the things we can control rather than the emotions we can't." Before Richard could respond, Anya called from upstairs, "Dad. I'm ready for my story." "That's my cue," he said, grateful for the interruption. "Good night, Lena. And thank you again." As the weeks passed, a new rhythm developed in the Parker household. Richard still worked long hours, but he made a conscious effort to be home for dinner at least 3 nights a week. Lena's presence brought a stability that had been missing, and Richard noticed subtle changes in Anya. She seemed happier, more settled, less clingy when he had to leave for work. One night, about a month after Lena started, Richard was working late in his home office when Lena knocked softly on his door. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. "I was about to leave, but I wanted to ask if you'd signed the permission slip for Anya's field trip to the aquarium next week." Richard frowned. "Field trip?" She didn't mention it. Lena's expression was carefully neutral. "It's been in her folder for a week." She might not have mentioned it because you were away on business when the trip was first announced. Richard felt the familiar pang of guilt. He'd been in Singapore for 4 days the previous week, negotiating a major distribution deal. The time difference had made it nearly impossible to maintain his usual evening calls with Anya. "I'll sign it now," he said, holding out his hand for the form. Lena hesitated. "There's something else you should know. Parents are encouraged to volunteer as chaperones. Anya asked me if I thought you would go." "Me?" Richard was genuinely surprised. "What did you tell her?" "I said she should ask you herself," Lena replied. "But she was afraid you'd say no because you're too busy." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His daughter was afraid to even ask him to participate in her life. "When is it?" he asked, pulling up his calendar on his computer. "Next Thursday, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Thursday was packed with meetings, including a lunch with potential investors. But as he stared at his schedule, Richard realized something. None of those meetings would remember or care whether his daughter had felt comfortable asking him to chaperone her field trip. "I'll be there," he said firmly, canceling the meetings with a few quick clicks. Lena's smile was warm with approval. "She'll be thrilled. Good night, Richard." After she left, Richard sat in his quiet office, thinking about the gradual changes in their home since Lena had arrived. It wasn't just that the house ran more smoothly or that Anya seemed happier. There was something else, a shift in perspective that was slowly taking root in his own mind. The field trip to the aquarium became a turning point. Richard arrived at Anya's school that Thursday morning dressed more casually than he had been in years, jeans and a sweater instead of his usual suit and tie. He felt almost as nervous as he did before major presentations to the board. Anya's face when she saw him waiting with the other parent volunteers was worth every rescheduled meeting. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist with pure joy. "You came. You really came," she exclaimed. "Of course I did," he said, hugging her back. "I wouldn't miss it." The day was a revelation. Richard found himself genuinely enjoying the wonder on the children's faces as they pressed their noses against the glass of massive tanks. Anya held his hand the entire time, proudly introducing him to her friends and teacher. "This is my dad," she said again and again, her voice filled with a pride that humbled him. During lunch, as the children sat in groups on the aquarium's outdoor terrace, Anya's teacher approached him. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mr. Parker," she said. "Anya talks about you all the time." "Please, call me Richard," he replied. "And thank you for organizing this trip." The children seemed to be having a wonderful time. The teacher smiled. "Anya has seemed much happier these past few weeks. More engaged in class, more confident. Your new nanny must be working out well." "She is," Richard agreed. "Lena has been transformative for our household." "Well, whatever you're doing differently, it's making a positive difference." Anya's even volunteered to read aloud in class, something she never did before. As they drove home that afternoon, Anya chattering excitedly about the octopus that had changed colors right before her eyes, Richard felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. It was a simple happiness, being present with his daughter, sharing her excitement, seeing the world through her eyes. That evening, when Lena was preparing to leave, Richard asked her to stay for a moment. "I wanted to thank you," he said once they were alone in the kitchen. "Not just for today, but for everything you've been doing." Lena looked curious. "I'm just doing my job." "No," Richard shook his head. "It's more than that. You've created a space where Anya feels secure and happy. But you've also..." He paused, searching for the right words. "You've shown me what I've been missing by burying myself in work." Lena's expression softened. "You're a good father, Richard. You just got lost for a while in your grief and responsibilities. It happens to the best of people." "Maybe," he acknowledged. But I don't want to be lost anymore. I want to be present for Anya in the ways that matter. That's a wonderful goal, Lena said. And from what I saw today, you're already making progress. Anya couldn't stop talking about how her dad took a whole day off work just to go to the aquarium with her. That night, after tucking Anya into bed, Richard sat on the edge of her mattress longer than usual. Did you have fun today? He asked. Anya nodded sleepily. It was the best day ever. Can we do it again sometime? The aquarium? No, she said, her eyelids growing heavy. Just you and me doing things together. Yes, Richard promised, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. We can definitely do that. As he kissed her goodnight and turned off the light, leaving only her star-shaped night light glowing softly, Richard made a silent vow to himself. He would no longer be just physically present in his daughter's life, he would be emotionally present too. And somehow, he had a feeling that Lena would help show him how. The weekend after the aquarium field trip, Richard did something unprecedented, he turned off his work phone. For 2 entire days, he ignored emails, missed calls from board members, and the constant pull of his professional responsibilities. Instead, he focused solely on Anya. They baked cookies that turned out slightly burned on the bottom, built a blanket fort in the living room, and watched animated movies that made them both laugh until their sides hurt. It was messy, unstructured, and nothing like the carefully planned family outings they used to have when Priya was alive. By Sunday evening, when Lena arrived to prepare for the week ahead, she found them both on the couch, Anya fast asleep with her head on Richard's lap as he gently stroked her hair. Looks like you two had a good weekend, Lena whispered, setting her bag down quietly. Richard nodded, a peaceful expression on his face that Lena hadn't seen before. The best I can remember in a long time. I'm glad, she said simply. Should I take her up to bed? I've got her, Richard replied, carefully lifting his sleeping daughter. But thanks for coming in early. I appreciate the help getting organized for the week. As May turned to June, Richard began making subtle changes to his work schedule. He started delegating more to his executive team, declined non-essential business trips, and scheduled late meetings for after Anya's bedtime so he could be present for dinner. His COO joked that he must have a secret girlfriend, but Richard just smiled and said he was reprioritizing. One warm evening, Richard arrived home to find Lena and Anya in the backyard. Lena was helping Anya plant flowers in a small garden bed that had been neglected since Priya's death. Dad! Anya called, her hands covered in dirt. We're making Mom's garden beautiful again. Miss Lena knows all about flowers. Richard felt a lump form in his throat as he approached. The garden had been Priya's pride and joy, a small sanctuary of color and life that she had tended with loving care. After she died, Richard couldn't bear to look at it, let alone maintain it. Your mom loved gardening, Lena explained to Anya as she demonstrated how to press the soil gently around a small plant. When we take care of her garden, it's like keeping a part of her with us. Is that okay, Dad? Anya asked, suddenly uncertain at Richard's silence. Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he managed, it's more than okay. Mom would be so happy to see her garden coming back to life. He knelt down beside them, not caring about the dirt on his expensive work pants, and asked, "Can I help?" That night, after Anya was asleep, Richard found Lena in the kitchen preparing lunches for the next day. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. Lena looked up. "Know what?" "About Priya's garden. About how to talk to Anya about her mother." Lena's hands stilled. "Anya told me her mom used to grow pretty flowers. And there were the photos in the hallway, I noticed your wife in the garden in several of them." She paused. "As for talking about loss, I've had some experience with that." Something in her tone made Richard curious. "Personal experience?" Lena nodded slightly. "My brother died when I was 12. Cancer. I'm sorry, Richard said, meaning it. Thank you. It was a long time ago, but I still remember how adults would avoid talking about him, thinking it would upset me. What they didn't understand was that not talking about him hurt more. It was like he was being erased. Richard thought about his own behavior, how he'd removed most photos of Priya, stopped mentioning her name, changed the subject whenever Anya brought up memories of her mother. He'd thought he was protecting them both from pain, but what if he'd been wrong? I've been doing the same thing, haven't I? He said, the realization washing over him. Trying to erase her because it hurts too much to remember. Grief is complicated, Lena said gently. There's no right or wrong way to handle it. But children need to know it's okay to remember, to talk about the person they've lost, to keep them as part of their story. Richard leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. I don't know how to do this, Lena. I don't know how to be a good father and run a company and keep Priya's memory alive all at the same time. You don't have to do it perfectly, Lena replied. You just have to try. And for what it's worth, I think you're doing better than you realize. The simple validation in her words touched something deep inside Richard. When was the last time someone had reassured him, rather than the other way around? As CEO, he was always the one providing direction, confidence, and solutions, never admitting vulnerability or uncertainty. Thank you, he said quietly. For everything you're doing for Anya. And for me. Lena smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached her eyes. That's why I'm here. As she turned back to preparing the lunches, Richard found himself studying her profile, the gentle curve of her cheek, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the quiet competence in her movements. For the first time, he saw her not just as Anya's nanny but as a remarkable woman in her own right. The realization unsettled him, and he quickly said goodnight, retreating to his office. But that night, as he tried to focus on quarterly reports, his thoughts kept drifting back to Lena, to her wisdom, her connection with Anya, and the way she'd somehow begun to heal wounds in their family he'd thought would never close. As summer approached, Anya's school year came to an end. Richard faced a new challenge: what to do with his daughter during the long summer break. In previous years, he'd enrolled her in a series of expensive camps that essentially served as daycare while he worked. This year, however, he found himself wanting something different. What if we created our own summer program? Lena suggested during their weekly planning meeting. These Sunday evening conversations had become a ritual, a time when they would sit at the kitchen table after Anya was asleep and discuss the week ahead. What do you mean? Richard asked, intrigued. Instead of shipping Anya off to a different camp each week, we could plan activities that are meaningful and connected to her interests, Lena explained. Some structure, some free time, some educational experiences, and most importantly, time with you. Richard raised an eyebrow. Time with me? My schedule is still fairly demanding. I know, Lena acknowledged. But what if you blocked out one day each week to be completely dedicated to Anya? No phone calls, no emails, just father-daughter time. I could handle the rest of the week, but that one day would be special. The idea both appealed to and terrified Richard. A full day away from work each week seemed impossible, yet the thought of regular, uninterrupted time with Anya filled him with a longing he couldn't ignore. Fridays, he said finally. I could make Fridays work. The smile that lit up Lena's face made something warm unfurl in his chest. Perfect, she said. Anya will be thrilled. They spent the next hour planning what they started calling Summer of Discovery. Mondays would be for science experiments and nature exploration. Tuesdays were designated for arts and crafts. Wednesdays would feature visits to museums, libraries, or historical sites. Thursdays were for community service projects appropriate for a 7-year-old. And Fridays were simply labeled Dad Days on the colorful calendar Lena created. When they presented the plan to Anya the next morning, her excitement was contagious. She danced around the kitchen, asking rapid-fire questions about what they would do each day. "What about swimming?" she asked suddenly. "I want to learn how to swim like Mom could." Richard felt the familiar pang at the mention of Priya. His late wife had been an excellent swimmer, she'd even competed at the collegiate level. "We can arrange lessons," Lena said smoothly, glancing at Richard with an understanding expression. Actually, Richard found himself saying, "I could teach you. Mom taught me, and now I can teach you." Anya's eyes widened. "Really? You can swim too?" The surprise in her voice made Richard realize how little his daughter knew about him beyond his identity as a businessman and her father. How many other parts of himself had he kept hidden away since Priya died? "Really," he confirmed. "We can add swimming to our dad days." The first Friday of summer vacation arrived, and Richard honored his commitment. He informed his executive team that he would be unreachable, ignored the concerned looks from his COO, and left his phone locked in his desk drawer when he left the office Thursday evening. That Friday morning, he made pancakes shaped like sea creatures while Anya giggled at his artistic attempts. After breakfast, they packed a picnic lunch and headed to the community pool for Anya's first swimming lesson. As he helped his daughter float on her back, supporting her small body with gentle hands, Richard felt a profound sense of connection. This was what mattered, these moments that couldn't be measured in profit margins or stock prices. When they returned home that afternoon, tired and sun-kissed, they found Lena in the kitchen preparing dinner. "You're still here," Richard said, surprised. Their arrangement didn't require Lena to work on his days with Anya. "I thought you two might be hungry after swimming," she explained, stirring something that smelled delicious. "I hope you don't mind. Can Miss Lena eat with us?" Anya asked, already setting an extra place at the table without waiting for an answer. Richard met Lena's eyes across the kitchen. "We'd love that, if you're free." That dinner became another turning point. As they shared stories of their day, laughing at Anya's dramatic reenactment of her swimming attempts, Richard observed the easy way Lena interacted with his daughter, gentle teasing, active listening, genuine interest in her experiences. There was nothing forced or artificial about their connection. Later, after Anya had gone to bed, Richard and Lena sat on the back porch, enjoying the warm evening air. "Thank you for dinner," Richard said. "And for suggesting dad days. Today was special?" Lena offered when he trailed off. "Life-changing," he replied honestly. "I've been so focused on providing for Anya that I forgot about actually being with her." Lena was quiet for a moment. "You know, in all my years of working with families, I've noticed something. Children don't need perfect parents, they need present ones." "I'm trying to be," Richard said. "I know," Lena replied softly. "And it shows. Anya is flourishing." As the weeks passed, their summer rhythm took hold. Richard found himself looking forward to Fridays with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. Each week brought new adventures, fishing at a nearby lake, hiking local trails, exploring the city's museums, and yes, swimming lessons that gradually transformed Anya from a nervous beginner to a confident little fish. But it wasn't just Fridays that changed. Richard found himself rearranging meetings to attend Anya's midweek activities with Lena. He started coming home earlier, declining after-work and networking events that once seemed crucial to his success. His priorities were shifting, and surprisingly, his company didn't collapse without his constant attention. If anything, his executive team seemed to rise to the occasion, taking on more responsibility in making decisions that previously would have waited for his approval. What Richard didn't fully recognize yet was how his feelings for Lena were also changing. The admiration he felt for her approach with Anya was evolving into something deeper, an appreciation for her wisdom, her gentle strength, and the way she had helped him reconnect with parts of himself he thought were lost forever. By mid-July, the Parker household had transformed. The once immaculate but sterile home now showed evidence of life. Anya's art projects proudly displayed on the refrigerator, a collection of seashells from their beach trips arranged on the windowsill, family photos that had been tucked away now returned to prominent places, including several of Priya. One particularly hot Tuesday afternoon, Richard surprised everyone, including himself, by coming home at 3 o'clock. He found Lena and Anya in the kitchen, making homemade popsicles with fresh fruit. "Dad!" Anya exclaimed, running to hug him with sticky hands. "You're super early. The air conditioning at the office is broken," he explained, loosening his tie. It wasn't entirely untrue, there had been an issue with the cooling system. But the old Richard would have relocated to a hotel conference room rather than lose productive hours. "Perfect timing," Lena said with a warm smile. "We could use a taste tester for our watermelon mint popsicles." "I think I can handle that responsibility," Richard replied, rolling up his sleeves and washing his hands at the sink. As the three of them worked together in the kitchen, Richard found himself watching Lena, the gentle way she guided Anya's enthusiastic but messy pouring, the sound of her laughter when juice splashed on her shirt, the graceful movement of her hands as she arranged the popsicle molds in the freezer. When had he started noticing these things about her? When had his appreciation for her caregiving skills evolved into awareness of her as a woman? The realization made him uncomfortable, and he busied himself cleaning up spilled juice to avoid meeting her eyes. That night, after Anya was asleep, Richard found himself pacing in his office. His growing feelings for Lena complicated everything. She was his employee, Anya's caregiver, someone he had brought into their lives to fill a specific role. Crossing that boundary seemed inappropriate, potentially disastrous. And yet, he couldn't deny the connection that had developed between them, not just their shared care for Anya, but the easy conversations they had about books, current events, and life philosophies during their evening planning sessions. The next morning, Richard was uncharacteristically quiet at breakfast. Lena noticed, catching his eye with a questioning look, but he avoided direct conversation. "Dad, can we go to the Science Museum on Friday?" Anya asked, oblivious to the tension. "They have a new dinosaur exhibit." "Sure, sweetheart," he replied, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. As he prepared to leave for work, Lena followed him to the door. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. "You seem distracted." "Just some work issues," he lied, unable to meet her eyes. "Nothing to worry about." "Richard," she said, her use of his first name bringing his gaze to hers. "You know you can talk to me if something's bothering you, right? Not just about Anya, but anything." The sincerity in her eyes made his heart tighten. "I know," he managed. "Thank you." For the next few days, Richard threw himself into work, staying late at the office and missing dinner. He told himself he was catching up on projects he'd neglected during his more balanced summer schedule, but deep down, he knew he was avoiding the complicated feelings that arose whenever he was around Lena. By Friday, he felt guilty about his absence, especially when he saw the hurt and confusion in Anya's eyes as he rushed through breakfast. "We're still going to the Science Museum today, right?" she asked tentatively. "Of course," he assured her. "I promised, didn't I?" The museum trip was exactly what they needed. Anya's excitement about the dinosaur exhibit broke through Richard's self-imposed distance, and soon he was fully engaged, reading display information aloud and asking the docent questions that delighted his science-loving daughter. They returned home tired but happy, Anya clutching a plush pterodactyl from the gift shop. Lena greeted them at the door, her face lighting up at the sight of their matching smiles. "Successful expedition?" she asked. "The best," Anya declared. "Dad knows so much about dinosaurs. He even corrected the museum guide about the Spinosaurus." Lena raised an eyebrow at Richard, who shrugged modestly. "I went through a dinosaur phase in college. Some information sticks with you." "Miss Lena, can we show Dad the surprise now?" Anya asked, bouncing with renewed energy. Surprise? Richard questioned. Lena nodded. It seemed like you've had a rough week, so we thought you might need something special. They led him to the backyard, where Richard stopped in his tracks. The patio table was set for dinner with candles and flowers. String lights had been hung in the trees, creating a magical atmosphere in the approaching dusk. We're having a fancy dinner, Anya announced proudly. I helped make dessert. This is... Richard was momentarily speechless. This is wonderful. As they enjoyed the outdoor meal Lena had prepared, Richard felt the walls he'd built over the past few days beginning to crumble. How could he distance himself from this? From them? After Anya went to bed, still talking excitedly about dinosaurs, Richard helped Lena clear the dinner dishes. Thank you for tonight, he said. It was exactly what I needed. We missed you this week, Lena said simply. The honesty in her statement broke something open inside him. I've been confused, he admitted. About? Richard set down the plate he was drying and took a deep breath. About my feelings. About boundaries. About what's appropriate and what isn't. Lena went still, her hands pausing in the soapy water. I see, she said quietly. You've become important to us, to Anya and to me. Maybe more important than I was prepared for. Lena turned to face him, her expression serious. Richard, I need to be clear about something. My priority is and always will be Anya's well-being. Whatever complications arise between us as adults, her happiness and stability have to come first. I agree completely, Richard said, relieved that she understood. That's why I've been keeping my distance. I don't want to risk what we've built for her. Lena dried her hands on a towel, considering his words. Maybe the question isn't what we risk by acknowledging these feelings, but what we risk by pretending they don't exist. Richard stared at Lena, her words hanging in the air between them. What did they risk by pretending? Everything and nothing, all at once. I don't have all the answers, he admitted. This wasn't part of the plan when I hired you. A small smile touched Lena's lips. Life rarely follows our carefully constructed plans, does it? Before Richard could respond, the baby monitor on the counter crackled with the sound of Anya's voice. She was talking in her sleep again, something about dinosaurs and ice cream. The moment broke, and they both smiled at the childish murmuring. We should probably continue this conversation another time, Lena suggested gently. Richard nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the interruption. Another time. As August approached, bringing with it the final weeks of summer, Richard and Lena maintained a careful balance. Neither mentioned their late-night conversation, but something had shifted between them. Their interactions carried an undercurrent of awareness, a shared secret neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Anya, perceptive as always, noticed the change. Why do you and Miss Lena act weird sometimes? She asked Richard during one of their swimming sessions. Richard nearly choked on pool water. Weird? What do you mean? Anya floated on her back, kicking her legs as he'd taught her. You know, like when you both reach for the same thing and then jump away super fast. Or when you look at each other when you think no one's watching. Out of the mouths of babes, Richard thought with an internal groan. Miss Lena and I are just getting used to working together, he explained weakly. Anya flipped over and treaded water, fixing him with a skeptical look that reminded him startlingly of Priya. You've been working together for months, Dad. Well, sometimes adults are complicated, Richard said, deflecting. Race you to the other side? The following weekend, Richard's mother came to visit. Eleanor Parker was a formidable woman in her 70s, sharp-minded and observant. She had been living in Arizona since Priya's death, giving Richard space to grieve but maintaining regular video calls with Anya. Within an hour of her arrival, Eleanor had assessed the situation with her characteristic directness. "So, the nanny," she said to Richard as they watched Anya show Lena her grandmother's gifts in the living room. "She's quite something." Richard tensed. "Lena's been wonderful for Anya." "And for you, it seems," Eleanor commented, studying her son's face. "You look better than you have in years. Less haunted." "We found a good balance," Richard admitted. Eleanor patted his hand. "Your father and I met when I was his secretary, you know." "Mom," Richard protested, "that was a completely different time, and it's not." "Don't mom me," she interrupted with a knowing smile. "I may be old, but I'm not blind. There's something between you two. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing," Richard said firmly. "Lena works for us. Anya adores her. I can't risk complicating that relationship." Eleanor sighed. "Richard, life is too short for such unnecessary caution. Priya would want you to be happy." The mention of his late wife sent a familiar pang through Richard's heart, but it was different now, less raw, more bittersweet. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Eleanor agreed. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing." That night, after Anya and his mother had gone to bed, Richard found Lena on the back porch again, gazing up at the stars. "Your mother is delightful," Lena said as he joined her. "Anya has her smile. And her stubbornness," Richard added with a chuckle. "She's been giving me relationship advice." Lena turned to look at him, her expression curious. "Oh?" Richard took a deep breath. "She thinks I should stop overthinking things and tell you how I feel." A long silence stretched between them. "And how do you feel?" Lena finally asked, her voice soft. Richard moved closer, close enough to see the reflection of stars in her eyes. "Terrified. Hopeful. Confused about the right thing to do. But very, very certain that you've become important to me in ways I never expected." Lena didn't pull away. "I've been struggling with the same feelings," she admitted. "It's not what I planned either. I've always kept professional boundaries with the families I work with." "So where does that leave us?" Richard asked. Lena looked thoughtful. "Maybe we need to redefine our arrangement. Maybe I shouldn't be Anya's nanny if we want to explore. Whatever this is between us." The suggestion hit Richard with unexpected force. "But Anya needs you. She's thriving with your guidance. She also needs a father who's true to himself," Lena pointed out. "And I could still be part of her life, just in a different capacity. What if it doesn't work out?" Richard voiced his deepest fear. "What if we try this and it fails, and then you're gone from both our lives?" Lena reached out tentatively and took his hand. "That's the risk with any relationship, isn't it? There are no guarantees." Richard looked down at their joined hands, feeling a peace he hadn't expected. "I think," he said slowly, "that some risks are worth taking." The following morning, Richard woke to the sounds of laughter from the kitchen. He found Anya, Eleanor, and Lena making French toast together, flour dusting all three of their faces. "Dad! Grandma's teaching us her secret recipe," Anya announced. Richard leaned against the doorframe, absorbing the scene, 3 generations of his family, and Lena, fitting so naturally among them it took his breath away. "We saved some batter for you," Lena said, meeting his eyes with a warmth that made his heart skip. "I wouldn't miss it," he replied, rolling up his sleeves and joining them at the counter. As they worked together, shoulders occasionally brushing, sharing smiles over Anya's head, Richard caught his mother watching them with knowing satisfaction. Later, as they all sat around the table enjoying breakfast, Richard realized something profound. This moment of simple joy, of connection, of family in its broadest sense, this was what success truly meant. Not the awards on his office wall or the company's stock price, but the ability to be present, to love and be loved in return. And for the first time since Priya's death, he allowed himself to imagine a future filled with more mornings like this one. The last week of August brought with it the inevitability of change. School would be starting soon, summer's freedom giving way to schedules and homework. Eleanor had returned to Arizona, but not before pulling Lena aside for a private conversation that left both women smiling and Richard suspicious. "What did my mother say to you?" he asked Lena as they walked through the neighborhood one evening, Anya riding her bike a few yards ahead of them. "That's between us girls," Lena replied with a mysterious smile. What Eleanor had actually said was simple but powerful: he's been lost since Priya died. You've helped him find his way back, not just to Anya, but to himself. After much discussion, Richard and Lena had come to a decision. Lena would continue as Anya's nanny until the school year began, maintaining professional boundaries during that time. Then she would resign from her position, and they would tell Anya about their wish to spend time together in a different capacity. It was a logical plan, one that gave all of them time to adjust to the idea. But logic couldn't account for the heart of a 7-year-old. One evening, as Richard read Anya her bedtime story, she interrupted with a question that caught him completely off guard. "Dad, do you like Miss Lena? Not just regular like, but like?" Richard nearly dropped the book. "Why do you ask that?" Anya shrugged, picking at a loose thread on her blanket. "Because you look at her the way Prince Eric looks at Ariel in my movie. And sometimes she looks at you the same way." Richard closed the book slowly, trying to formulate a response that was honest but age-appropriate. "Would it bother you if I did like Miss Lena that way?" Anya considered this seriously, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Would she still help me with my science projects and make peanut butter sandwiches with the crusts cut off?" "Yes, of course." "Would she still read me stories with different voices for each character?" "I'm sure she would." "Would she live here with us instead of going home at night?" Richard coughed, unprepared for the directness of the question. "Well, that's something adults usually decide after they've spent a lot of time together. It's not something that would happen right away." Anya nodded thoughtfully. "I think it would be okay if you liked Miss Lena. She makes you smile more. And she helped us fix Mom's garden." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "Your mom would have loved that we fixed her garden." "I know," Anya said with a child's simple certainty. "Mom would like Miss Lena too. She's kind and smart, just like Mom was." Later that night, Richard recounted the conversation to Lena during their evening walk around the block, a new ritual they'd established to have time to talk privately. "She's an incredibly perceptive child," Lena said when he finished. "She gets that from her mother," Richard replied. "Priya could always read people instantly. I'm more the type who needs a spreadsheet to understand my own feelings." Lena laughed softly. "I've noticed." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment. "Maybe we don't need to wait until school starts," Richard suggested. "Maybe we can talk to her together, explain how we feel about each other." "Are you sure?" Lena asked. "I don't want to rush anything, especially where Anya is concerned." "I think we've been anything but rushed," Richard said wryly. "And it seems she's figured most of it out already." The next day was Saturday, the last weekend before school began. They decided to take Anya for a picnic at the park where they'd spent so many summer days. Under the shade of a large oak tree, with sandwiches and fruit spread out on a blanket, Richard and Lena exchanged a nervous glance. "Anya, sweetheart," Richard began. "We want to talk to you about something important." Anya looked up from her sandwich, eyes curious. "Miss Lena and I have become good friends over the summer," he continued. "Very good friends. And, well, we'd like to spend time together, not just when she's taking care of you." "You mean like dating?" Anya asked directly. Richard smiled at her candor. "Yes, like dating. That means Miss Lena wouldn't be my nanny anymore, Anya said, piecing things together. Lena leaned forward. That's right. I couldn't be your nanny if I was dating your dad. But I would still be in your life, just in a different way. Anya considered this, head tilted. Like how? Like a friend, Lena suggested. Someone who still helps with homework and reads stories and goes on adventures with you and your dad. But who would take care of me after school? Anya asked practically. I've arranged to adjust my work schedule, Richard explained. I'll be working from home most afternoons. And we've found a wonderful after-school program for the days I can't. Anya was quiet for a long moment, absently picking grass from the edge of the blanket. If you and Miss Lena get married someday, would she be my mom? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lena moved closer to Anya, her voice gentle but firm. No one could ever replace your mom, Anya. Your mom will always be your mom, and she'll always be in your heart. But, Richard added carefully, families can grow and change. People can love each other in new ways without replacing the love that was there before. Anya nodded slowly, then looked up with unexpected brightness. Can I be the flower girl if you get married? Richard and Lena both laughed, tension breaking. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Richard said, ruffling her hair. We're just starting to date. Grown-ups are so slow, Anya declared with an exaggerated sigh that made them laugh again. As they packed up their picnic later that afternoon, Richard watched Lena helping Anya collect fallen leaves for a school project. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a golden glow around them both. 6 months ago, he had hired a nanny out of necessity, seeing it as simply another business arrangement to maintain the functioning of his household while he focused on what he thought mattered, his company, his career, his ambitions. What he hadn't expected was how watching Lena with his daughter would change everything, his priorities, his understanding of success, and ultimately, his heart. Life rarely followed carefully constructed plans. Sometimes, it offered something far better instead.